Have you ever stopped to think that sometimes the biggest clue isn't in what we see, but in what someone tried to erase? Well, in this case, a simple burned map hides secrets capable of overturning everything we believe to be true. Before we begin, let me ask you, are you subscribed to the channel? If not, please subscribe now, like, and comment. It really helps spread this investigation and keep the flame of curiosity alive. What I'm about to share here isn't just an investigation story. It's a dive into puzzles, logic, and mental challenges that would test any brilliant mind. Brace yourself, because nothing is as it seems. Burning a piece of paper can mean much more than destroying evidence. It can be an invitation to a calculated game where every hidden detail turns into a surprising revelation. What if I told you that this map not only revealed the whereabouts of a criminal, but also brought to light controversies buried for generations? A web of conspiracies, false leads, and even moral dilemmas that challenged not only my experience as an investigator, but also my very vision of justice. That's where things get dangerous. Because when the past mixes with the present, the line between truth and lies becomes thinner than ever. So stay with me until the end of this video. You'll realize that this torn map isn't just about crime, but about choices, courage, and how we deal with the secrets that try to manipulate us. And I guarantee, with each revelation, you'll feel part of this investigation, as if you were right there with me deciphering each enigma. After all, who said a burnt piece of paper can't change entire destiny? Never forget the dusty smell that filled my nostrils in that forgotten attic. Among the boxes, old newspapers, and yellowed photographs, something caught my eye. A time-worn wooden chest, nearly hidden beneath a torn sheet. Curiosity has always been my driving force, and it was precisely this curiosity that made me force the rusty padlock. Inside, among faded letters and ownerless medals, lay an object that would change the entire course of the investigation. It was a map, but not just any map. Part of it was burned, as if someone had tried to erase an inconvenient truth. The charred edge still exuded that lingering smell of burnt paper. My eyes scanned the tortuous lines, and I realized this was no mere geographical representation. It was a riddle, a silent invitation to delve into the unknown. It was in that instant that I understood every detail there hid a story. How many times in life have you come across something seemingly insignificant, yet seemingly carrying a secret? That's how it was for me when I saw that piece of paper. A simple crooked line could indicate a secret path. A dark stain could hide a crucial point. I've always believed that life gives us signs, but only those who pay attention can interpret them. And at that moment, I decided I wouldn't let anything go unnoticed. As I turned the map over in my hands, I realized he wasn't alone. There were scribbles, symbols, and even strange handwriting in the margins. This wasn't just any find. It was an invitation to decipher codes, face enigmas, and uncover secrets buried for decades. But the real question echoing in my mind was, why would someone burn the very section that revealed the most important location? This doubt would be just the beginning of a much more complex mind game. At that moment, I realized I couldn't analyze the map in isolation. To truly understand it, I needed to delve into the time in which it was drawn. Each line reflected a period marked by secrets and silent disputes. I discovered that the map dated back to the 1940s, a time when Europe was still licking the wounds of war, and the underworld flourished in the shadow of Reconstruction. Forgotten places, underground tunnels, and abandoned houses became perfect hiding places. It wasn't the first time I'd stumbled across decades-old clues. I'd investigated letters from prisoners of war, safes buried in backyards, and even diaries written with secret codes. Everything seemed to indicate that the map wasn't made to make anyone's life easier. On the contrary, it was designed to confuse, protect, and keep the curious away. The story it carried wasn't just about geography, but about fear, power, and conspiracy. As I read old newspapers, I found accounts of smuggling, clandestine networks, and crimes that were never solved. Some names kept recurring, almost like ghosts that insisted on haunting the present. It was curious to see how a simple piece of paper could weave together past and present, revealing plots that spanned generations. I knew that the deeper I dug, the more dangerous the ground I treaded. What intrigued me most was the precision of the details that remained intact. It was as if someone had left that infinitum on purpose, a calculated invitation for someone, perhaps me, to follow the trail. But if the map was indeed a key to finding a criminal, who would have benefited from keeping it for so long? This question haunted me like a shadow, and I was about to discover that the story hidden behind that paper was much bigger than I imagined. It didn't take long for me to realize that the burned area wasn't a coincidence. The fire seemed controlled, aimed precisely to erase the most revealing part of the map. I've seen criminals destroy evidence before, but this precision intrigued me. It was as if the author wanted to leave enough to pique curiosity, but never allow anyone to discover the whole truth immediately. As I stared at the blackened edges, I remembered an old case where documents were partially burned to hide the names of those involved. The criminal mind is cunning. It prefers to eliminate only the essential, preserving the rest as a form of manipulation. The same thing seemed to have happened here. The question was, who would be so careful not to destroy everything? Surely someone who still needed that map but didn't want others to have full access to it. I touched the paper and noticed thicker layers of burns in specific spots, almost as if they had been deliberately marked. This wasn't just destruction, it was a warning. As an investigator, I've learned that every detail is a message, and that fire spoke volumes. It told me there was someone in the shadows, following every step of anyone who dared follow the map's trail. It was a psychological game, and I was officially in on it. Even more disturbing was the thought that the fire might have been lit recently, not decades ago. This changed everything. It meant the criminal was still active, alive, making sure no one discovered his secrets. And if that was the case, there was no doubt he knew someone would eventually find the map. The real question was whether I was too late, or whether I was exactly where he wanted me to be. When I finally focused on the map's margins, I realized this wasn't just ordinary scribbles. The handwriting seemed nervous, yet meticulously calculated. There were strange, almost archaic symbols mixed with words in a language reminiscent of Latin. It was the kind of writing learned not in school, but in closed societies where knowledge is guarded as secrets. This wasn't just writing. It was a code. I remembered a case I investigated years ago, in which a suspect used seemingly meaningless notes to hide messages among diaries. We only managed to decipher them when we realized that each word corresponded to a coordinate. Perhaps it was the same thing here. What intrigued me was the choice. Why risk writing in the margins of a map, knowing it would attract attention? Or perhaps that was precisely the goal, to leave a clue disguised as coincidence. The more I analyzed, the more I realized that the handwriting was the heart of the investigation. They weren't just random symbols, but instructions, as if someone had left an invisible manual. And this made me reflect. How many times in life do we miss obvious signs because they don't seem important? The human mind tends to ignore subtle details, but that's precisely where the fear usually hides. The curious thing was that some characters were bolder, as if they were intentional markers. This made me suspect there was a logical sequence, perhaps even a puzzle to be solved. It wouldn't be the first time criminals had relied on codes to protect vital information. But what really chilled me was the thought that someone, at some point, had wanted this puzzle to reach my hands. And this thought led me to believe that the real revelation was yet to come. As I compared the map scribbles with some old notes I found in police files, I noticed a curious pattern. Certain symbols corresponded to numbers. At first, it seemed like just an illogical sequence, but the more I analyzed it, the more I realized there was a hidden message. It was like those children's puzzles where we connect seemingly unconnected dots and suddenly a figure appears. Only in this case, the figure wasn't an innocent drawing, but a dangerous secret. I spent hours formulating hypotheses, just as I did in my first cases. It's funny how riddles have the power to lull us into an almost hypnotic state. You forget about time, from worries, and surrendered completely to the challenge. With each attempt, a new piece of the mystery was revealed. I realized the code used substitutions. Numbers represented letters, and together they formed words that pointed directions on the map. But something was still missing, as if it were an incomplete password. It was then that a trick I learned from an old military cryptographer came to mind. He said, "Never look at what's written, but at what's hidden between the lines." I noticed that some symbols repeated themselves in strategic positions, almost like markers in a maze. As I rearranged the elements, a coordinate began to form before my eyes. It was fascinating to think that decades later someone could still be trapped in this same mental game. However, there was a catch. The further I progressed, the more I realized the puzzle wasn't complete with just what I had. It was like putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle with only half the box. And this led me to an inevitable suspicion. Perhaps the map had been fragmented by different hands, and the piece I'd found was just the beginning of a long hunt. And it was precisely this idea that paved the way for my next discovery. When I overlaid the map with current geographic charts, I noticed a disturbing discrepancy. Some lines didn't match anything that existed today. Roads had disappeared, rivers had been diverted, entire neighborhoods had changed their names. It was as if time had shuffled the board, making my task even more complex. To decipher that trail, I would need to go back in time, revisit old records, and even consult retired cartographers who still had vivid memories. It wasn't just a matter of location, but of interpretation. A seemingly simple line, which to many might have been just a poorly drawn line, represented to me an underground tunnel used during smuggling. And then I'd seen this before in another case, when a poorly aligned drawing pointed to a hidden cellar beneath a church. I understood that on that map, nothing was random. Every curve, every line, was a whisper of a dangerous past. The most curious detail was that part of the geography didn't appear in any modern records. This made me wonder, what if the criminal had precisely taken advantage of these forgotten spaces? Places erased from collective memory, but preserved on paper, would serve as perfect hiding places. This discovery wasn't just a clue to finding someone. It was also a lesson in how what we ignore often holds the greatest truths. As I followed these winding lines, I felt like I was walking through an invisible territory, where the present and the past overlapped. And the deeper I delved, the more I realized that geography wasn't just physical, but also mental. The map was a test to see how far I was willing to go, and it was at that moment that I understood the real challenge wasn't just reading what was on the paper, but seeing what no longer existed. As I delved deeper into my investigation, I discovered that the region marked on the map wasn't just any old spot. It was shrouded in long-standing controversy. Documents from the time revealed that the location had served as a smuggling route during the war years. Weapons, stolen jewelry, and even missing persons were linked to the area. It wasn't hard to understand why someone would have reasons to keep this secret buried. This wasn't just history. It was a barely healed wound. Old newspapers spoke of a scandal hushed up by the authorities. Several powerful figures were accused of covering up illegal activities there. But curiously, the cases disappeared from the archives. This reminded me of how, in other investigations, there was always an invisible hand manipulating the facts, making evidence disappear, and silencing witnesses. It was as if the map were living proof that insisted on withstanding the test of time, pointing to a truth no one dared admit. This controversy wasn't just about past crimes, but about reputations preserved at any cost. Imagine discovering that respected families, seen as exemplars of morality, had their roots buried in the mud of smuggling. It's uncomfortable, but the truth has this power. It doesn't choose who it will bother. And often, the greatest resistance we face comes not from criminals, but from those who have the most to lose if the mask slips. As I connected these pieces, a feeling crept over me. Perhaps I wasn't dealing with just one isolated criminal, but with an entire network, a dark legacy spanning generations. The burned map wasn't just a geographical clue, but a symbol of the desperate attempt to keep this story locked away. And the further I delved, the more I realized I was stirring up a nest of snakes that wouldn't want to be exposed. What seemed like a story buried in the past soon revealed its most dangerous side. The map wasn't just pointing crimes from decades ago. There were clear signs that the same marked route was still being used today. Recent police reports mentioned strange movements in the region, unsolved disappearances, and even covert operations that mysteriously failed. It was as if past and present were stitched together by the same invisible thread. By cross-referencing the map's coordinates with modern records, I identified robbery incidents that followed a pattern. Trucks disappeared on back roads. People were last seen near old buildings. And curiously, some witnesses reported hearing noises in abandoned tunnels. It was impossible to ignore. The map wasn't just a historical reminder, it was a manual still in use. This made me realize I was chasing something much more alive than I'd imagined. The most disturbing thing was when I realized that certain symbols scratched into the margins matched marks found at recent crime scenes. It was as if the map's author had left an identifying code, used by those still operating within that network. And at that moment, the investigation ceased to be just about an old mystery. I was hunting someone who was walking at the same time as me, breathing the same air, and perhaps observing me closely. This connection to current crimes made me realize that I wasn't just uncovering the past, but directly interfering in businesses that still operated in the shadows. It was no longer a matter of curiosity or intellect, but of survival. Every step from that point on meant stepping into territory controlled by criminals who would not hesitate to silence any threat. And that's how I realized that the burned map was in fact an invitation to immediate danger. It didn't take long for me to realize that the piece I held in my hands was just part of a larger puzzle. The selective burning made even more sense. It wasn't just an attempt to conceal information, but also a clue that other fragments existed scattered throughout. It was as if someone had deliberately torn the map into several pieces, entrusting different people with the responsibility of guarding them. This turned the investigation into a veritable scavenger hunt. I rummaged through old archives and discovered accounts from heirs who mentioned scraps of paper kept as family heirlooms. Curiously, none of them seemed to understand the value of what they possessed. To them, they were mere meaningless mementos. But when compared, the threads connected like pieces of a mosaic. This reminded me of how, in life, we often hold answers before our eyes, but we only see them when we bring together different perspectives. The most intriguing part was wondering who had masterminded this division. It didn't seem like the work of a common criminal, but rather someone with an almost obsessive strategic vision. Separating the pieces meant increasing the difficulty for anyone trying to get to the truth. And in a way, this made the puzzle even more fascinating. Each fragment found was one step closer to a revelation capable of changing the entire narrative. But there was something that unnerved me. If other pieces were still in circulation, it meant more people were involved, even if they didn't know it. And this raised an inevitable question. Who else had access to these pieces and could get there before me? I wasn't just reconstructing a map. I was competing in a silent race against invisible hands that also wanted to reach the end of this maze. As I began to cross-reference the names linked to the map, I realized that the list of possible suspects was as varied as it was intriguing. On one side, antique collectors who would give anything to own a rare artifact. On the other, descendants of families with a dark past who preferred to keep their secrets buried. Among them, unlikely figures emerged, such as ex-military personnel who knew the region intimately, and smugglers who still operated in the shadows. Each suspect carried their own story, and it reminded me of a chessboard. There were no irrelevant pieces. Even the seemingly innocent pawn could hide a lethal move. The collector could be passionate about history, or simply use it as a cover for illicit dealings. The heir might seem disinterested, but perhaps he had more to gain than he let on. The difficult part was separating the innocent from the accomplices in a scenario where everyone had something to hide. Dealing with this kind of diversity always requires patience. As an investigator, I learned to listen more than I spoke, to observe the details that no one else pays attention to. A hesitant expression, a pause too long, a lost look. All of these betrayed more than words, and in that network of characters, every gesture could be the key to revealing who was truly manipulating the map fragments for their own benefit. What struck me most was how, even though they didn't know each other, these suspects seemed connected by an invisible thread. It was as if they were all orbiting around the same secret, each guarding a piece of it. But I knew that, inevitably, their paths would cross. And when they did, the truth wouldn't just be revealed, it would explode like a bomb, hitting everyone who dared to linger nearby. As I re-examined the map's margins, I noticed that some symbols aligned not only with each other but also with ancient constellations. This was no coincidence. It was an astronomical enigma. As I plotted the positions of the stars from the time the map was drawn, new coordinates began to emerge. It was fascinating to think that the author had used the sky itself as a safe, holding the key to unlock the mystery. This type of code wasn't new to me. In a previous investigation, I found a diary in which the Siftic marked his smuggling meetings according to the phases of the moon. The logic was simple. Anyone without astronomical knowledge would never discover the pattern. With the map, it seemed to be the same principle, but on a larger, almost poetic scale. It was as if the criminal had let the universe conspire in his favor. I spent nights trying to decipher the drawings, Using ancient celestial charts and modern simulators, I discovered that certain combinations of stars pointed to specific points on the terrain, creating an alignment between heaven and earth. This wasn't just a puzzle, it was a work of genius or madness. Only someone obsessed with control could have built such a sophisticated system to protect their secrets. But there was something even more intriguing. The calculations didn't work with the current sky, only with the positions of stars from decades ago. This meant that if I hadn't looked at historical records, I would have missed the trail. And this discovery made me think about something bigger. How often do we insist on looking at the present when the answer can only be found in the past? This reflection pushed me to the next stage of the investigation. It was at this point in my investigation that I met a peculiar figure, an elderly man who lived secluded on a small farm on the outskirts of the city. He was known as a collector of memories, someone who kept old papers, forgotten records, and stories no one wanted to hear anymore. Entering his home, I felt as if I had stepped through a portal to another time, walls covered in maps, shelves crammed with books, and drawers reeking of the past. Conversation after conversation, I realized he knew much more than he let on. His eyes betrayed secrets. His mouth refused to confess. At one point, he let slip a phrase that stuck with me. Not all maps are for finding places. Some are for testing those who dare follow them. It was then that I understood. This man was a guardian, someone who for some reason had taken on the responsibility of protecting parts of the enigma. My life as an investigator has shown me that, often, the greatest danger lies not in those who commit the crime but in those who cover it up. This man didn't seem to have direct ties to smugglers or criminals, but his loyalty to secrecy was evident. He spoke as if protecting not only information but also the very order of things. Perhaps for him, revealing too much meant destabilizing a fragile balance that had been maintained for decades. Yet something told me his silence wasn't absolute. Between the lines, he dropped clues, as if testing my resolve, and every gesture, every lingering glance, seemed to indicate he knew exactly where the next fragment lay. I just needed to prove I had the courage, or stubbornness, to continue. It was in this game of veiled provocations that I realized the Guardian wasn't just a character in the story, but a living key to what was to come. After days of deciphering clues, I finally reached a point marked on the map. My heart pounded, as it always does when I feel I'm about to touch the heart of a mystery. But upon arriving, I found only empty ruins, peeling walls, and a silence that sounded like mockery. It was at that moment that I realized the map was not only a guide, but also a trap. Someone had planned to lead the investigator astray, diverting him from the true path. This wasn't the first time I'd encountered a false location. In an old investigation, I remember tracking a suspect for weeks, only to discover he'd deliberately left tracks in places he'd never been. The logic was cruel. While the police wasted time following false leads, he continued his activities in peace. The same seemed to be happening here. The false location wasn't a mistake. It was pure strategy. The curious detail is that even in the deception, there was value. As I took a closer look at the ruins, I noticed symbols engraved on the walls, similar to those on the map. It was as if the criminal himself had left a signature, a silent message that he was always one step ahead. This taught me a valuable lesson. Even dead ends hold information. You just need patience to decipher it. In life, how often do we believe we're wasting time, when in fact we're gaining experience? As I walked back, I realized this move had another purpose: to test my persistence. Anyone who gave up after the first disappointment would never reach the final truth. But if I kept going, I might find the right path. It was in this mix of frustration and fascination that I understood the false location wasn't a failure, but a planned step to separate the curious from the true truth seekers. And I was willing to follow through to the end. It was as I reviewed every detail gathered so far that I realized this wasn't an isolated case. The map, the fragments, the false leads, everything was part of a larger scheme, planned with almost military precision. The criminal wasn't using the map simply as an escape route, but as a network of movements. Each mark indicated not only a hiding place, but also rendezvous points and alternate routes. It was a full-scale chessboard, and I had just seen the game. This discovery reminded me of old investigations in which smugglers used secret trails to mislead the police. But there was something different here. The plot wasn't just for transporting goods or people, but also for controlling anyone who dared approach. The map was more than a tool. It was a psychological weapon, designed to confuse and exhaust. The more I understood, the more I realized I was dealing with someone with rare intelligence. From that point on, the investigation ceased to be about finding just one criminal and became about understanding his mind. Each clue, each symbol seemed to carry a personal signature, a way of saying, "I control the game." It was as if the map were a mirror of the author himself, reflecting his need for control and his vanity in always being more cunning than others. Understanding the plot was, in a way, confronting his own essence. But the most important revelation was yet to come. This network wasn't just a criminal's whim, but something inherited, nurtured for generations. The map connected not only places, but also people, entire families living in the shadow of this web. And it was at that moment that I understood. I wasn't just investigating an individual, but unraveling an ancient conspiracy that still pulsed behind the scenes of the city. It was at this point in the investigation that a dilemma began to plague me. I discovered that one of the people close to me, someone I trusted, held valuable information about the map. But this person was hesitant to speak. The reason was simple. Revealing the truth meant putting their own life at risk. It was like watching someone balancing on a tightrope between loyalty and fear. And I had to decide how far I could push. In my career, I've encountered many situations where silence wasn't just cowardice, but survival. I saw witnesses refuse to cooperate for fear of reprisals, and even family members distance themselves to protect their loved ones. This memory made me wonder, to what extent is it fair to demand courage from others when the price may be too high? This moral conflict affected not only the investigation, but also my own conscience. In a way, I understood that hesitation. Who hasn't been afraid to expose something even knowing it would be the right thing to do? How many times have we held back because we feared losing our safety, our reputation, or even the people we love? Life, like investigations, is made up of these silent dilemmas, and there's no manual that tells us the perfect decision. There's only the courage to face the consequences. As I looked into this person's eyes, I realized the choice wasn't just hers, but mine as well. If I persisted, I could open dangerous doors, but I could also save innocent people still trapped in this criminal network. It was as if the map wasn't just a piece of paper, but a mirror reflecting my own choices. And deep down, I knew, sooner or later, I would have to decide whether to follow the path of justice, no matter the cost. It was at this moment that the map revealed its final challenge. Hidden among the symbols and scribbles was a seemingly simple logical riddle, yet one that required absolute concentration. It was a sequence of coordinates that, when connected, didn't form an exact location, but an equation. And like any good riddle, the solution lay not just in the numbers, but in how to interpret them. It was as if the criminal had left a final test of intelligence, a barrier to keep out the weak-minded. I spent hours poring over that code, jotting down hypotheses in notebooks and redoing calculations. The mind, in those moments, becomes a battlefield. Each failed attempt is a shot against your confidence, and each breakthrough is a silent victory. I remembered an old case where a password was hidden in the Fibonacci sequence but only revealed itself when read backward. The criminal's logic seemed to play with this same kind of inverted reasoning. I realized the puzzle wasn't just mathematical, but symbolic. There were drawings of triangles, circles, and squares, like pieces of a geometric puzzle. Each shape corresponded to a movement on the map, almost like instructions for a board game. The solution required not only calculations, but also imagination. This made me reflect. How many times in life do we insist on linear reasoning, when the answer appears when we dare to change perspective? The moment I finally cracked it, a shiver ran down my spine. The enigma pointed not just to a physical location, but to an inevitable encounter, the exact spot where the criminal was waiting for someone like me to arrive. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a direct call. The feeling was clear. The shadow play was reaching its climax. From that point on, there was no turning back. When I finally pieced it all together and the logic seemed clear, a revelation completely changed the course of the investigation. I'd always believed the map's original owner was the criminal, someone who'd created it to protect their secrets. But when I cross-referenced forgotten documents with testimonies from former residents, I discovered something unexpected. That map hadn't been written by a culprit, but by a victim. A man who, decades earlier, had tried to expose the entire criminal network. This discovery hit me like a punch in the gut. The partial burning of the map, the enigmatic codes, even the false locations. Everything made sense in a new light. The author didn't just want to confuse. He wanted to protect the truth until someone was able to decipher it. It was like a message left in time, a desperate cry from someone who tried to resist and was silenced. The real criminal wasn't on the paper, but in the shadows that tried to erase him. This kind of turn of events made me reflect on how often in our lives we judge things by their appearance. How many people have been wrongly convicted simply because they had no way to defend themselves. The truth often lies not on the surface, but hidden in details that only reveal themselves to the persistent. Patience and the courage to look beyond appearances are virtues that save investigations and also lives. Deep down, I realized I was facing not just a mystery but a legacy. The map wasn't just an object burned by time. It was a victim's last attempt to ensure justice prevailed. And that changed everything. The investigation was no longer about finding just any culprit, but about honoring the memory of someone who dared to face an empire of shadows. And I was more determined than ever to complete this mission. When the pieces finally began to fall into place, I felt that mixture of relief and excitement only an investigator knows. It wasn't just about unraveling the map, but about winning the mind game proposed by someone who believed they were always ahead. Each symbol deciphered, each enigma solved, was like traversing a maze and getting closer to the center. It was confirmation that patience and persistence always overcome chaos. This triumph was not only technical, but also psychological. For weeks I lived inside the mind of the map's author, trying to anticipate his moves, predicting his intentions. With each new discovery, it was like tearing off a mask, revealing a little more of who was behind the plot. And upon understanding his logic, I felt I had gained more than information. I had gained mastery over the invisible adversary itself. This feeling reminded me of something I often say. Overcoming enigmas is like overcoming yourself. It's not just about solving numbers, symbols, or codes, but about facing our own doubts, insecurities, and exhaustion. How many times in the middle of the night have I thought about giving up? But each time I persisted, I proved to myself that the human mind is capable of much more than it imagines, as long as it has a clear purpose to follow. The burned map, which at first seemed like a burden, became my intellectual trophy. Not only because I had reached a point few would reach, but because the investigation proved something greater, that no shadow, no matter how dense, can withstand the light of truth. And in that instant, I knew I was ready for the next step, to face the criminal head-on, at the exact point where all logic had led me. I reached the point marked by the riddle, with the feeling that each step echoed louder than the last. The place was dark, almost forgotten by time, and the silence only increased the tension. My heart beat steadily, but my mind was on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hide a gaze. Every sound of the wind sounded like a held breath. There was no room for error here. This was the final board, where player and opponent would finally meet. When I saw the silhouette emerging from the shadows, I felt the weight of all the hours of investigation. The criminal wasn't just a present-day figure, but the heir to a plot that spanned generations. His gaze carried the arrogance of someone who always believed he was one step ahead. But for the first time, I noticed something different, a flash of surprise. Perhaps he hadn't expected anyone to have the courage or patience to approach him. The confrontation wasn't just physical, but mental. Sharp words were exchanged like blades, each trying to chip away at the other's trust. He spoke as if he owned the game, trying to convince me it was all just an illusion. But I had something he couldn't control. The truth. And the truth, when revealed, has the power to disarm even the most calculating of enemies. There, before him, I realized it was no longer me who was playing the game, but he who was cornered. Still, I didn't underestimate the danger. The criminal mind is capable of unexpected maneuvers, and one last move could cost dearly. But in that moment, I remembered every puzzle solved, every fragment reconstructed, and every person who had placed hope in the truth coming to light. This gave me the strength to remain calm, face my adversary, and ensure that finally the map ceased to be an instrument of shadows and became a symbol of justice. When the investigation finally came to a close, I realized that the map was no longer just a burned piece of paper, but a symbol. It carried the memory of a victim who tried to fight the darkness, and also proof that no truth remains buried forever. Every line drawn, every fragment recovered, now had a new meaning, no longer as instruments of crime, but as silent witnesses of resistance and courage. The map's legacy wasn't limited to solving the case. It became a powerful reminder that logic, persistence, and the relentless pursuit of truth are weapons as lethal as any revolver. How many would give up when faced with a seemingly insoluble enigma? How many would abandon the trail at the first false start? The map taught that only those who remain steadfast, even in the darkest hours, can penetrate the shadows and find the way out. This case made me reflect on how we all carry maps in our lives, fragments of experiences, memories, and choices that when connected can reveal who we truly are. Sometimes we burn parts of these maps trying to hide pain or failures, but deep down it's precisely these marks that give meaning to our journey. The real secret isn't in erasing what we've experienced, but in learning to decipher each piece of our own story. As I tucked the map away in a folder marked Solved, I knew it would never be just another cold case. It had become a milestone, not only in my career, but in the certainty that knowledge and courage can rewrite destinies. Because in the end, the investigation wasn't just about finding a criminal, it was about proving that truth always finds a way to survive, even when it's burned. Now I ask you, how many burned maps have you ignored in your own life? How many clear clues, disguised as everyday details, have you missed out of fear, haste, or simple distraction? This case showed that often, the truth lies not in what shines before our eyes, but in what someone tried to hide. And if you had the courage to look at the burnt fragments of your history, what would you discover? Perhaps a forgotten talent, an abandoned dream, or even answers that could change your journey. The map I followed wasn't just about criminals, it was about persistence, logic, and the ability to see beyond the obvious. And that, believe me, can transform your life too. But tell me, would you have followed this riddle to the end? Or would you have given up at the first false clue? I want to hear your opinion here in the comments. Share it with me, because it's through dialogue that we connect and grow. And if this story touched you in any way, now is the time to act. Because knowledge without action is like a burned map. It leads nowhere. So subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay tuned. Here, each video is an invitation to delve into mysteries that not only intrigue the mind, but also awaken something within us. After all, the true investigation begins when you decide to decipher the enigmas of your own life.